Today on Nerd of the Rings, we continue our look at the maps of Middle-earth by covering the lands of the Second Age. As we mentioned last time, the realms of Beleriand are decimated by the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, causing the vast majority of the lands to sink into the sea. Today we'll begin our journey with some of the remnants of Beleriand. First up is Tol Morwen, an island off the coast of Forlinden. This location is where Morwen, the mother of Turin, is buried. During the First Age, the location is known as Cabed Neremarth, and is the location of the Stone of the Hapless, a hallowed tombstone of sorts, marking the deaths of Turin, Númenor, and Morwen. It is said that this island and the stone itself are among the little that remains of Beleriand after the First Age. The largest of the three islands seen here is Tol Fuin, named for the lands they originated from, Tar Nufuin, or if you recall from our First Age video, they were once the highlands of Dorthonion, where Beren once roamed with his father, Barahir. Finally, we have the island of Himling, which was once the hill of Himring, stronghold of Maithros. This island lies roughly 25 miles away from northern Linden. Speaking of Linden, let's make our way to the mainland. Linden is broken up into two parts. The northern section is known as Forlinden, while the south is known as Harlinden. These realms were once part of Osiriand during the First Age. The realm is led by Gil-galad, now the High King of the Noldor. Other notable citizens of Linden at the beginning of the Second Age are Elrond, Galadriel, Celeborn, and Círdan. Círdan and the elves of Linden established the Haven of Mithlond, or as you may know it, the Grey Havens. As mentioned when we covered Beleriand, we also have portions of the Blue Mountains that survived the War of Wrath. While the dwarves of Nogrod and Belagost would start the Second Age in their cities, by the year 20, they would journey to Khazad-dûm to join the dwarves descended from Durin. Lake Nanuiel, also known as Lake Evendim, lies roughly 100 miles north of what would one day be the Shire. This body of water, roughly 50 miles long by 20 miles wide, would become home to Galadriel and Celeborn after they leave Linden shortly into the Second Age. The northern area of Forodwaith is named for the people who live there. These lands were very cold from the earliest days of Middle-earth, when Melkor had his fortress of Utumno in the far north, leading the lands around it to be affected by Melkor's evil cold emanating from the fortress. The Forodwaith people were a hardy people living in the icy northern lands. While we don't know much about this civilization, we do know the last remnant of these people would still be around in the Third Age, the Lossoth, but we'll talk about them when we come to the Third Age. Also in the north, we have the peak of Mount Gundabad, the location where Durin awoke in ancient days. Durin makes his way south, eventually settling within the Hithyglir, also known as the Misty Mountains. There, he founds the dwarf kingdom of Khazad-dûm. Later in the Second Age, after Sauron invades Eregion, Durin's folk, also known as the Longbeards, seal the doors of Durin. The orcs in turn would take Mount Gundabad, a holy site for the dwarves. The Ered Mithrin, or Grey Mountains, would be infested with orcs well into the Third Age. In the northeast, we have the lands of Rhovanion, whose most notable inhabitants are the elves of Lorinand, which would come to be known as Lorien, and the realm of Greenwood, led by Thranduil's father, Orofer. While ruled by Sindarin lords, the population of each realm is mostly Sylvan elves. The Lonely Mountain, since at least the earliest days of the Second Age, was under the control of Durin's folk, but would not come into play much during the Second Age. Likewise, the Longbeards of Khazad-dûm colonized the Iron Hills during the First Age, which became the dwarves' primary source of iron ore. When the orcs take over Mount Gundabad and the Grey Mountains, it cuts off communication between Khazad-dûm and the Iron Hills. Also in the lands of Rhovanion, we have some of the Northmen, or Middlemen, who were ancestors of the Rohirrim. These were men who were not of Númenorian descent, but also were not openly hostile to the Númenorians. They are more separated from other men of Middle-earth, and are actually taught agriculture by the Entwives. In turn, they give great honor to the female Ents. For more on these men, check out my video on the Eotheid people. Returning west to the previously mentioned Eregion, we find the elven realm led by Celebrimbor, the elf smith who led the creation of the Rings of Power. The capital is Ostin Ethil, and is located close to the entry of Khazad-dûm. It was Celebrimbor and his friend Narvi the dwarf who created the Doors of Durin during the Second Age. After Sauron creates the One Ring, he leads open war on the elves of Eregion and the larger lands of Eriador. Eregion is destroyed, Ostin Ethil is sacked, and Celebrimbor is killed. These events would eventually lead Elrond to establish the realm of Rivendell with the refugees of Eregion. As I mentioned in my last video, Eriador in the First Age was part of a massive forest, encompassing most of the lands we know as Middle-earth. It was the war of the elves and Sauron that led to the final deforestation of much of the realms in Eriador, including Enethwaith and Miniriath. However, the deforestation of these realms had begun centuries earlier, by the same people who would help save Eriador from Sauron's destruction, the Númenorians. In the 7th century of the Second Age, the Númenorians come to Eriador, founding the port of Londair, and harvesting large amounts of trees. The open hostility between the men of Miniriath and the Númenorians would lead the former to welcome Sauron's attempted conquest in 1693. However, Sauron would burn most of what remained of the forest in his retreat. Enethwaith was a similar situation. However, while the surviving men of Miniriath would become part of the future realm of Arnor, Enethwaith would ally with neither. The men of the realm, known as the Gwathrum, would forever hold a hatred toward the Númenorians and their descendants. They would remain allied with Sauron, and in the Third Age, these men, also known as the Dunlendings, would ally themselves with Saruman, helping him in the Battle of Helm's Deep and later in taking over the Shire. Now that we know some of the actions of their enemies, we should take a look at the island realm of Numenor. This island was a gift to the Edain from the Vala Ulmo for their part in the war against Morgoth during the First Age. Now, I'll eventually do an entire video on the history of Numenor and their actions, but for now we'll just highlight the geography. The star-shaped island has distinct regions seen here on the map. The northern section is called Forostar, which is a land of rocks and cliffs. This land, which measures roughly 200 miles from the North Cape to its southern border, also features woods of larch and fir. To the west, we have Endustar, a mostly fertile region which features 3 bays on its western edge. The northernmost bay is called the Bay of Endunier, featuring a port and city of the same name. In the southwest, we have Hyrunastar, which was known for its farmlands and vineyards. Hyorastar is in the southeast, and its woods was the source of much of the wood the Númenorians used in building their great ships. In the northeast, we have Orostar, another area of farmland where Númenorians grew much of their grain. Heading inland, we have the region of Matalmar, with its pastures and grasslands. This is Númenor's most important region, as it contains the capital, Armenelos, in its eastern half. Also of note is Meneltarma, a sacred mountain in the center of the island. Also known as the Holy Mountain, it was devoted to Eru Iluvatar. It was required of any who climbed the mountain to be absolutely silent, and even the animals of the land didn't approach the summit. Only the eagles of Manwë were found to be near the summit. They were regarded as sacred guardians of the mountain and the land of Numenor. There's a few sub-regions to note here as well. Emerie is where the Númenorians raised and herded sheep. Nismaldar housed the great haven of Eldalonde, said to be the most beautiful of all Númenor's havens. Finally, Arondor, also known as Kingsland, is home to the capital as well as the port of Romena. Armenelos, in addition to being the capital, is also where Sauron would advise the king to build a temple for the worship of Melkor. The eastern port of Romena was an important location to the group of faithful Númenorians who didn't follow Sauron's influence. As Sauron leads the larger faction of Numenor, known as the King's Men, to rebel against the Valar, Eru destroys the island. It was from the port of Romena that Elendil and his sons would lead 9 ships of the faithful to Middle-earth, having foreseen the destruction to come. There they would gather both the Númenorians and the indigenous people of the lands and establish the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor. Arnor encompasses much of the lands we discussed earlier, while Gondor is much larger than we would later see it in the Third Age, notably including the lands of Calenarthon, which would later become the Kingdom of Rohan. Not only would the destruction of Numenor force the relocation of the faithful, but it would also affect the elves of Lindon, who suffer great loss as the sea comes upon the land due to the displacement of Numenor. Now, as we return to the south, you'll no doubt recognize Mordor as it stands in the lands of the southeast of Middle-earth. But what of the lands surrounding it, from which Sauron gains many of his allies? We'll begin with the lands of Rhûn, also known simply as the East. As we've learned in my previous videos, this was a favorite area of Sauron to retreat to when things got dicey for him. This, combined with the fact that Morgoth previously had a heavy presence in this area as well, makes it no surprise that Sauron would find followers in the East. While the Easterlings will no doubt be the inhabitants most familiar to fans, we know that there were also 4 Dwarven clans located in the lands of Rhûn: the Iron Fists, Stiffbeards, Blacklocks, and Stonefoots. Also, according to Tolkien's later writings, the Blue Wizards would come to Middle-earth within the Second Age, meaning they could have been at work in these lands during this time. Once again, we'll cover more about the people and events of these regions in their own videos, but for now we'll continue our journey through the geography of the Second Age. In the south of Middle-earth lies the lands of Harad. This is home to the Haradrim and the great Oliphants of Middle-earth. Unlike the Easterlings, we know a bit more about the Haradrim. Initially, the relationship between the seafaring Númenorians and the Haradrim was a fruitful one. The Númenorians established the havens of Umbar, while the Haradrim learned agriculture and craftsmanship from the Númenorians. However, as Numenor turned to darkness, so too did their interactions with others. They came to set themselves up as lords over their allies in Middle-earth, demanding tribute and oppressing the peoples of Harad. The land of Khand is one that we hear far less often than the previous two. As their known actions come in the Third Age, we will simply note in this video they are known as the Variags, and would often ally with Sauron or the Haradrim in attacking Gondor. As we will see in future videos, the corruption of Numenor and the influence of Sauron would make these southern and eastern realms into enemies of the Men of the West in later years. The surviving Númenorians and their descendants would go on to build some of Middle-earth's most iconic monuments during the Second Age, including structures like the Tower of Orthanc, the cities of Minas Ithil, Minas Tirith, and Osgiliath, and the Watchtower of Aman-Sul, with even more to come in the Third Age. In the next Maps of Middle-earth video, we'll cover the Third Age map, including the downfall of Arnor, the shrinking of Gondor, the founding of Rohan, and the dwindling of the Elven and Dwarven realms. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters, including Tom DeBombadil19, Gail Elizabeth, Jim Limber Davis, Sky Carcass, Salim Rahman, Smorzer, Zetrock, Gimelkad, Grand Strategy Nerd, Debbie, Chief 40123, Mid-Earth Wellness, and the Dark-Haired One. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.